As a scientist, I made lots of trips to communities to talk about the impacts of climate change and how to adapt to them. And I'd like to share one memorable experience, I guess, I had while I was on the road. It was the year 2000, and I was at a workshop for Canadian and US professionals from the Great Lakes Basin. My presentation was, why adapt? And my goal was to motivate these people to rethink, to plan and take action, or adapt to climate change. I used maps, graphs, tables with lots of numbers. You know, the things that we scientists love to use. But I also talked about the impacts and the economic costs and the implications for people's quality of life. I thought I had done a bang-up job laying out the scientific case for climate change adaptation, and I actually hoped that I might inspire them to take some action. When the floor opened for questions, a rather agitated participant was the first to stand up. Ma'am, you're talking about changes in the future, 2020s, 2050s. That's a long way away. Plus, those impacts that you're talking about, they're only projections. We're well prepared, so I don't see them happening in my community. Plus, if changes start to happen, we'll have enough time to react. Plus, ma'am, you're advising us to adapt to climate change. Why should we listen? Why should we act? Besides, how certain are you of your climate change science? Would you be willing to offer up your firstborn child? I went, woo, I've never had a question quite like that. I thought, oh my goodness, you know, we scientists, we like facts. So I was expecting to get, you know, the nitty-gritty technical details. So I was really taken aback. I was no longer allowed to be the rational, by-the-numbers scientist. I had to think and feel like a mother. This gentleman was making it personal. Stopped and thought, but you know, it is personal. Now, no mother wants to offer up their child as a sacrifice. But my children and future generations motivate my research. In a sense, I can see potential futures, not like a soothsayer, but with the tools of my trade, hard scientific tools, climate models, climate projections, and impact assessments. They help me diagnose threats, opportunities, and where action would be prudent. The evidence is overwhelming. Climate adaptation is necessary and urgent. And didn't this guy get it? So also, didn't he understand that he was a participant in climate change adaptation, whether he wanted it or not? Paused and thought, you know, my case is really strong. So I said yes to him. And I offered up not one, but both my children, Patrick and Allison. Now, many of you here believe in climate change and that something has to be done about it. But I suspect that you may still hold a few preconceptions about the nature of climate change and how to do adaptation. In my experience, I'd like to sort of get at 3 myths and slash them. Myth number 1, climate change will happen sometime in the distant future. Myth number 2, climate change will happen to someone else and not me. Myth number 3, it will be easy to adapt to climate change. So myth number 1, climate change will happen in the way distant future. Actually, we are now in the midst of a climate transformation. We just don't know it. Statistics would tell us that, but how many of us collect data and know the statistics of our air temperature? Slowly unfolding changes just creep up on you. You know, the fabled freshman 15 weight gain? Or worse, white hair and wrinkles magically appearing? And doesn't it seem when you first notice those changes that they seem to accelerate and you're getting older faster and there's no going back? Well, that's what's happening with climate change. So if we're in the midst of a climate transformation, how do we know it's so? We scientists, we're on it. Since 1990, we've tabled or presented 5 climate change assessment reports to the governments of the world. I've participated in most of them, and I tell you, you have to be on the top of your game to participate. It is a rigorous, demanding process. Our assessments use the highest caliber research. We use millions of observations from around the world taken over hundreds of years. And that is the foundation for us making statements on the state of the climate system. I'd like to share some of those statements with you. And I'd like you to listen very carefully to the words. They were chosen with painstaking care by the scientists and approved unanimously by over 150 countries of the world. I'd say that's a pretty awesome accomplishment. We've done it 5 times. So what's the statement? In 1995, we were detecting a human influence on the climate system. In 2001, there was a discernible human influence on the climate system. In the 2013 report, warming of the climate system is unequivocal. And human activity is the dominant cause of warming since the 1950s. So when international scientists and world governments use a word like unequivocal, they mean it in a literal sense. Leave no doubt. So if we're in the midst of a climate transformation and we can measure it, what are the consequences? Let me take you to Houston, Texas, which was recently hit by Hurricane Harvey. Some scientists say that climate change may have made Harvey worse. How is this so? Well, we know warming heats the ocean, which feeds hurricanes. Warming also heats the atmosphere, and it lets hurricanes hold more moisture or water that can fall as rain. But that's only one example. What really concerns me is that warming fuels extreme events. That's not just hurricanes. That's heat waves. That's droughts, floods, and wildfires, all becoming stronger, lasting longer, and becoming more frequent. That is climate change. Now, myth number 2 is climate change will happen to someone else and not me. And it's really interesting. I have observed that most people feel that the worst impacts will happen to someone else. They deflect. But climate change is going to happen to you. And it's going to affect you directly. And it will also affect your families, your communities, your cities, your natural areas, your regions. And it will also affect you by what happens in some of the other countries around the world. Let me use sea level rise as an example. Bangladesh has often been identified as a place where that's a humanitarian crisis in the making. Bangladesh sits just a little above sea level. It's at the mouth of 3 huge rivers, and it's exposed to tropical cyclones, and there's very little protection. About 10% of Bangladesh's population may be displaced by sea level rise caused by climate change. That's 18 million environmental refugees, or about half of Canada's population. And that's not just the end of it. Bangladesh is only one of many other countries in coastal areas that are going to experience sea level rise, flooding, and displaced people. It becomes a world problem. I'd also like to draw your attention to the fact that climate change will also affect you closer to home, and use Vancouver, British Columbia, as an example. Coastal communities in British Columbia are already planning for sea level rise because of climate change. 50 centimeters by 2050, 100 centimeters by 2100, and 200 centimeters by 2200. There's also been neighborhoods that have been identified as potential future flooding hotspots. Their names you'll recognize: English Bay, Kitsilano Beach, Gastown in the downtown east side, for example. Now, imagine that you're a business owner or a resident here. Your neighborhood is in transformation. You will be likely to experience more flooding, and risk to displacement, emergency evacuation, loss of income and property will also be an increasing risk to you. So, what can you do? How can you adapt? These are the difficult questions. This leads me to addressing myth number 3. It'll be easy to adapt to a changing climate. You know, change is difficult. Think about losing weight. The first 5 pounds, okay, they come off relatively easily. But the next 10 or 20 or 30 pounds require planning, commitment, and effort, and also may require a transformation in your diet and your lifestyle. That's the same thing with climate change. Let me take you back to the example of sea level rise in Vancouver. In the early stages of adaptation, the climate threat is increased flooding during storms. So our goal is to protect health and safety and the built environment. I call it the sandbags and dikes phase. That means that the adaptation is traditional and incremental. What we do is that we do risk assessments, for example. We look at who's vulnerable, what's at risk, and where, and we think about retrofitting existing dikes and building new ones. But if you take the longer view, you're going to recognize as the climate system transitions, we are likely to tip into uncharted extremes. That means our plans will no longer function as they should, or maybe we won't be able to afford them anymore. The adaptation gets really, really messy. Think again to those hotspot neighborhoods that are hotspots for flooding. At what point would the community decide that the flooding risk is too great, that they would relinquish the land, abandon their homes and businesses, and retreat from rising sea levels? Can you imagine how difficult that conversation or conversations would be, and how difficult those choices might be? That's the challenge of adaptation. Now, dare I also talk about innovative, out-of-the-box adaptations? Planners, architects, and engineers are reimagining the coast, the relationship between land and water along the coast. And they're designing amphibious subdivisions. Now, that's a transformative adaptation. In my talk, I've dispelled 3 myths. I'm going to replace them with the 3 realities of human-caused climate change. It's happening, it's going to affect you, and it's going to require transformational adaptation. Now, I don't want you to be discouraged. I'm not, and I've been working on the climate change issue for over 30 years. And I am hopeful, and I am certain that we can and will meet this adaptation challenge. Remember how I said that we are all in this adaptation journey, whether we want to be or not? I'd like you to think about how you can contribute, what roles you can play. We need thinkers, people who can look at a problem in a new way and find innovative, transformative solutions, things that we hadn't thought of before. We need doers, people who can shepherd these innovative ideas through the natural controversies and inevitable barriers when you bounce up against the status quo. We also need supporters. Supporters are fundamental to enabling the thinkers and the doers. And we also can't discount when supporters use their voices, like voting, to build social and political support for those innovative and transformational ideas. I offered up my children, Patrick and Allison, for climate change. It wasn't a joke. I was serious. I was going at that guy. I was serious about my science, and I was serious about the need to adapt. And if we all don't act, we will be offering up our children to climate change. So looking forward to the challenges of adaptation, let's not offer up our children, grandchildren, and future generations. Let's think transformational adaptation. Let's be innovative, energetic, and brave, and let's build a better future. Thank you.